Okay, I think we are live. I want to welcome everyone to this webinar on social investment and homelessness, perils and opportunity as part of the Impact Festival 2020. I want to thank the Center for Homelessness Impact for organizing the session. I will kick off with some housekeeping, which is to remind you that the session is live streamed and it will be recorded, so will be made available for those who cannot join right now. Everyone should be muted. I will invite, you are all invited to post question in the chat function that you will find at the bottom of the screen. We will come to the question at the end of the session. I will kick off with introducing the panelists. We have four distinguished panelists who will have all 6 minutes each to make an opening statement, and I will monitor time to allow enough for a Q&A from the audience. I will maybe ask some follow-up question, and then I will move to Q&A from the audience. If you are a social media savvy person, there is a hashtag. Can the hashtag be put on the chat? Is CHI for Center for Homelessness Impact Fest 2020. So tweet away to share sound bites of this session. That's going to be extremely interesting. So here we are, our four distinguished panelists. I have Professor Gary Painter from the University of, from the Department of Public Policy and the Sol Price Center of Social Innovation. He is the director and he covers homelessness policy research at the Institute in Southern California. We have Andrea Iriulian from the Coran Hilton Foundation as a senior program officer for a domestic program, who will talk to us about the work they are doing in Los Angeles County. I have Karen Ng from the Big Society Capital in London. She is investment director. And we have Simon Chisholm, who is chief investment officer at Resonance, another impact investor for complex social issues. I'm Mara Eroldi, I'm the moderator, and I'm the director of the Government Outcome Labs, which is a research center at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. So without any delay, I would like to jump straight in our topic, and I will ask first Gary to give us an opening statement. You will have 6 minutes. Can you share your key insight on the role of social investment and social innovation in particular to tackle homelessness and the challenges of social innovation in homelessness? The floor is yours.
All right, I'd be happy to do that, Mara. Thank you so much to you, Mara, and also to the Center for Homelessness Impact for putting the panel together. Given that I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview of the intersection between social innovation, homelessness, and the first thing that I ask myself when I think about whether social innovation and social investment should be applied to a problem is the problem complex? How did we get here? Why is it intractable? What's going on? And I think that all of us can agree that homelessness, as it manifests itself in various parts of the world, in many cases, it's addressed through basically departments, bureaucracies, and so on and so forth that operate in very different silos, or at least traditionally have. So the health systems are working on it, the housing systems are working on it, workforce systems, just to name a few, all have implications by their actions. And therefore, it really requires both cross-department, cross-sectoral problem solving in ways that haven't been done before. And in many places, and it's certainly true in the US, there's just simply insufficient resources that are allocated to solving this problem, which then opens up this question about maybe we need to rethink social investment for this particular problem. So why might social innovation be applied? Well, first, I like to define what I view social innovation is. And of course, there's different definitions that have been floating around for the last 2 decades. But I view social innovation as an iterative, inclusive process that uses innovation frameworks to produce more effective and just solutions to address complex social problems. So again, thinking about innovation frameworks to address these problems, it actually starts with disrupting the status quo. And then after you've kind of shocked the system enough to say the status quo is untenable, then it begins a process, an iterative, inclusive process. So it begins with co-producing ideas, moving to piloting, to scaling, etc. But what's important about those early steps is that you need to have a critical co-production process, or for those in the UK, you would use the term co-creative process, to actually generate those ideas from which to pilot. And we've seen, and I'll return to that in a moment with one example around social impact bond, pieces of what I would call a co-productive process or co-creative process, but an incomplete one. The social innovation process then moves to piloting. And what I like to say is that you pilot to pivot. And that's a little bit of a hashtag for anyone that likes the social media, but you're piloting to learn enough to know whether you need to go back to the drawing board with your ideas and co-produce new ideas, or to scale ideas that appear promising. And I've often found, certainly here in Los Angeles, that people pilot and then don't know what to do with the pilot. And so there's not really a whole process linked together. And then finally, it requires really a diffusion strategy, so that when you scale promising ideas, that you actually have a strategy to change systems, to change culture, to change how we engage. And so there are lots of questions associated with this. Related to the subject of this panel and the expertise on the panel is, how do you fund such a process for change? I could say a lot about it, but again, the experts are on this panel, so I'll let them kind of talk about it most. But I would like to just note that I think we all agree it can't all be private, it can't be all philanthropic, it can't be all public. We have to figure out ways how to leverage change, how to really coordinate, right? And so we'll talk about that. In my own research, I've looked at one possible instrument that could fit the bill, but it's still an open question, and that's the social impact bond, a pay-for-success contracting structure, a payment by results contracting structure, depending on, again, where you are in the world, what terminology you use, which possibly could fit the bill. And I've written a paper recently to kind of think whether social impact bonds is actually an innovative new tool that can bring in new private or philanthropic capital, specifically private capital, to address social investment, or whether social impact bonds can actually facilitate the process of social innovation. And I'll just share some short insights now, happy to share more in the Q&A if we have that opportunity. The question of, does it bring in new capital? The answer is yes, it does. Does it bring enough new capital in to warrant the complexity of a contract of a social impact bond? Again, which I haven't explained, but could in the Q&A, but with only 6 minutes to go, I'm just going to jump right in. But what we see in the UK is that the new capital that has been brought in primarily by two important players. One is on the panel, Big Society Capital. Bridges is another important player. But some might argue that it may not be new capital for social investment. It might just be through this particular channel. In the US, there is a broader network of private and philanthropic capital that has actually been cultivated as a much more thriving ecosystem. And we've seen that philanthropic capital has been leveraged, and Andrea can talk about how Hilton did that in LA context to bring in private capital. But there's also been, a crowd-funded social impact bond as well. So there's been some interesting spaces for people to participate in this sort of an instrument that wasn't there before. And I'll just say something briefly about, can it actually facilitate that social innovation process that I described, which moves from co-producing new ideas to piloting to scaling to diffusing. And on the issue of co-production, I would say that it's really good on the back end of co-production. So it actually has players, the people who actually need to change systems, they're part of the contract because they are the back end payer on the social impact bond contract. However, not so good as it relates to co-producing and co-creating ideas with people who are actually with lived expertise, who are actually impacted by that program. And so there's some work being done now to think about how to do that better. Finally, we kind of assessed the data in the US and the UK, and it looks like that, that social impact bonds do a much better job of scaling promising ideas than they do kind of providing funding for pilots. And in part, that's because, especially in the US context, where 91% of all social impact bonds are at the scaling stage, it requires a rigorous evaluation of the outcomes. And because of that, you need a sufficient sample size. So you actually, in many ways, need a promising idea that's ready to scale in order for people to actually put together that more complicated contract, the social impact bond for success. In the UK case, it's actually about 2/3 that we looked at that appear to be operating a pilot to scale. So with that, I'll pause and let my panelists speak more about social investment and homelessness specifically. I didn't talk as much about homelessness at this point, but clearly this structure and framework has been used to address homelessness in both the US and the UK and in other countries.
Thank you, Gary. I'll pick up your suggestion and I'll move on to Andrea to talk about your experience as a philanthropic organization in working with this new instrument, a new tool across different sectors. What was the experience at the foundation?
Thanks so much, Mara. Hello, everyone. I'm from the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. We are a global philanthropic funder, but our work on ending homelessness is focused in Los Angeles County. And one of the key tenets to the foundation's 30-year commitment to this work is that housing ends homelessness. So when we talk about systemic change or the evolution or changes to the way that public sector funding or private funding is spent that Gary talked about, one of the major focuses that the foundation has is to move resources and efforts toward housing with supportive services. And the primary population that the foundation has supported over all of these years are those with very complex behavioral and physical health needs in particular. Those at highest risk of dying on the street, the most vulnerable. And so several years ago, the Hilton Foundation many years ago, funded actually a pilot project here in Los Angeles County to try to support individuals who are in our county jail system to exit out into supportive housing. So rather than being released into the general population, those individuals would be picked up at the jail by a case manager who they already had a relationship with. They'd be moved into interim housing where they'd receive supports until they could be moved into a permanent supportive housing unit. And the pilot projects went fairly well. And so we began to talk with our county partners about how we could roll this project into something more sustainable and at a larger scale. And it was around the time that the social impact bonds or pay for success or pay for performance projects were really getting launched. And so we began to pursue that route. As Gary mentioned, it was incredibly complicated. It took many, many years. We had to inform political leadership here locally about how Pay for Success worked. And actually during our education process, there was a turnover in leadership. There was an election and we had to start all over with several of our political leaders here in the county. That extended the process even more. We were able to bring in a new funder to LA County who had not yet funded in the space. So that was very exciting on the private side. That was very exciting. The project is up and running. I will say during the process, we built enough infrastructure that I believe that we potentially could have done the systemic change without the Pay for Success project, but I know that that doesn't always happen in other communities. So some of us who worked on the project wish that there had been a point where we had said, let's pause. Everyone seems very excited just about this project generally. Could we do it without all the complicated Pay for Success deal structuring? But we did it, and we're a couple of years in. The results of the first few years should be released in the coming months. We're learning a lot about the system, about doing the project to scale. I will say we are having some discussions about the challenges of creating culturally sensitive outcomes when you build Pay for Success. We thought we were selecting outcomes that would best serve those who were being served, that were client-centered. But the reality is that when you really talk to the communities and those with lived expertise, that sometimes the metrics we set when it comes to Pay for Success are very strict and stringent and potentially don't leave enough flexibility in the program and project to really create adaptations that best serve the clients. I will just quickly share one more thing. The Hilton Foundation also does a significant amount of program-related investment, which are low interest lending primarily to community development financial institutions here in LA County. These are much simpler deals, and we have found immense success, particularly around the development and construction of housing here in LA County, spurring and catalyzing that housing using those sorts of investments. So Gary and I have had many long conversations about how there are lots of different ways to do social impact investing and which ones really take the time and whether it's warranted to go all the way to pay for success, which is a very time-consuming effort compared to using something more like a program-related investment if you can create the will in other ways to achieve those goals. So I'll pause there, and I look forward to answering some questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Simon, can I come to you, asking you to bring the perspective of an investor? So you raise capital. This is a project on homelessness. Is it philanthropy? Is it an investment?
Sure. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to participate this afternoon. And as you say, my perspective is really from Resonance. We are a social impact investment company. We've been around now in the UK for about 18 years, and our essential mission is to connect investment into social enterprise. So I think that partly answers your question, although philanthropy is massively needed and often comes alongside what we're doing. Our primary focus is on channeling repayable capital into these types of impact areas. But I think the important thing from our perspective, which has always been at the heart of what we're trying to do, is to start with the social enterprise. So you can start from the investor's end of that spectrum, or you can start from the social enterprises end of that spectrum. And for us, it's been important to see our strategy as an impact fund manager, which is what we now are and the main way in which we deliver our mission. But our strategy is to identify areas where the social enterprise sector is underserved for investment resources and to tailor those investment resources to the need. So I think in the area of homelessness, that has been kind of most clearly borne out in what we've done around homelessness move on property funds. So this is an initiative that really began almost a decade ago now, when we were approached by a homelessness charity who was focusing on the need for move-on accommodation for people with relatively low or no support needs, but who were essentially stuck in hostels or bed and breakfast accommodation, unable to transition back into the private rented sector. So, bad for them in terms of their progression, but also bad in terms of silting up the system and not allowing people to progress. But it was really about breaking down the barriers to allowing people to get back into independent living. The solution was not ours. The solution was a social enterprise solution which had been developed by a homelessness charity over a number of years, very entrepreneurially on their part, to recognize that they were better placed to assess whether an individual was ready to make that transition, and therefore better placed to essentially, in a sense, underwrite the risk and take the risk on that tenant, making a success of that tenancy. So there were other frictions as well, like the fact that the private rented sector would want a rent deposit, and they were able to structure a model that would allow people to move into property without that. And in all those ways, they had created a social enterprise that was breaking down very effectively that aspect of the problem. Clearly, homelessness, massively multidimensional problem at many levels, but this particular element was being effectively addressed through that social enterprise model. So really, from our perspective, the only question was, how can impact investment support and scale that type of successful model? So the work for us was to figure out that in this case, a property fund that could raise investment from investors in a way that they were fairly used to seeing their money raised into, but then partner with a homelessness charity or multiple charities in the end to allow them to access that property, in this case on lease terms that worked for them and the tenancies they were seeking to create. So for us, that's been a 10-year journey with that particular initiative around move-on accommodation for homelessness. It's seen a degree of scaling up within individual locations. It's seen a degree of evolution in terms of the understanding of the tenant cohort, even within that defined cohort who are ready for independent living. the difference between single tenants, mother with child, the needs that differ in those cases, and the ability of the homelessness organisation to adapt and provide different provision for those different types of need. We feel that the homelessness property fund approach has been able to adapt and evolve with that need, and also allowed the model to be replicated into other geographies. So originally this model with our first partner began in London, and then it was possible to replicate it into 3 other cities in the south of the UK, Bristol, Oxford and Milton Keynes, and we're now looking to replicate it into the northwest. Each time we do so, it becomes apparent that obviously the problem is also sometimes geographically related, and there are different dynamics at play that relate to the economic situation of the region, or particularly some of the pathways that have been created within that region by local authorities to address these problems. So it's not replicate a kind of a standard model. Sometimes it's adapting it to suit local need. And I guess the final theme for us has been, the need to recognize a lot of the specialism which exists in terms of dealing with different cohorts of people. So we feel that the model that we built around move on accommodation has adapted well to, for example, both individual homelessness, single homelessness, and families. It's adapted recently, in fact, to the immediate need to transition people out of hotel accommodation, which has been one of the things that COVID has led to in the UK, and we think we can play a part through these funds in providing routes out of that. But it's not proved particularly effective for supporting smaller scale organisations, particularly, for example, women's sector organisations working with vulnerable women, for example, fleeing domestic abuse and needing homes in that context. And so we have seen the need sometimes to step away from the scaling model and go back to, I think what Gary was talking about, the ability to pilot something at smaller scale and to see what works, and potentially to reach organizations who are not themselves at the point of being able to scale something across multiple regions, or even at vast scale in the region they're in. So for us, that's led to the need to create a new fund. Again, Karen will no doubt talk a little bit more about this, but focused on the needs of women in safe homes, and specifically the organizations that support them. So I suppose it's an example of where sometimes an initiative scales very successfully, adapts very successfully to some needs, but then you reach a point where you realize something different is needed. And it's about being able to say, yes, both are valid. And one cannot imagine that one tool will serve all needs. I don't know if that's helpful, or whether I've exceeded.
Very helpful. Thank you, Simon. Karen, what is your experience as an investor on these new models?
Thank you very much. So I think what I'll probably do here is to tell you more about Big Society Capital, what we do, some exciting things that we are doing recently, I think alluded by Simon as well, and just to walk through kind of the 3 main ways of different approaches, different innovative models that we see are kind of emerging in this space. So a little bit about Big Society Capital. We are quite quirky in the sense that we are set up just to make social investments that generate a return, but also a social impact. We're seeded by funds from the UK government, but we're run completely independently since we launched around 8 years ago. So there's a significant focus for us in housing and homelessness. Over the years, we've invested over 100 million UK pounds via funds such as the one run by Simon at Resonance, who's really, I think he's really, really humble. I think they're truly a pioneer in this space, developing a really sustainable model with the national charity here, as in one goes. So very recently, since the lockdown this year, we're also working with the central government to coordinate a social investment response to help people who are housed during the pandemic, to prevent them going back on the streets and go back to long-term stable housing. We've started with 30 million of our own capital, which will be made available in the coming weeks. So hoping, we know that this problem is much bigger than what we can provide and do single-handedly. So we're really hoping to crowd in more capital in that sense. So taking a step back more, kind of, I guess your question is around some of the innovative models that we see. So I guess as a social investor, there are three main ways that we work. One is we fund services, we acquire housing, and we also build housing. So the way that we fund innovative services mainly is through outcome-based contracts, or as Gary just talked about, the social impact bonds that sometimes they're called. One example that I really like to highlight is the Rough Sleeping Social Impact Bond in Greater Manchester. It's funded by Bridges Fund Management and delivered by Greater Manchester Homes Partnership. They use what they call a housing first approach, which is really about supporting entrenched rough sleepers and taking away all those ladder and different steps required by rough sleepers historically to demonstrate, so that they can actually get the housing first before they can also get the kind of wraparound support. So it's innovative because it's really flexible. It takes a partnership approach. It's not just about providing a roof over people's head. It's connecting them with local employment and mental health services, and truly trying to work with people with a kind of a person-centered approach. What is really, I guess, attractive from the public government's point of view is it's created significant savings to the government. It's been running for 2 years, and so far it has cost 50% less than comparable housing first pilots that are run by central government, and so far has housed more than 300 people in the region against the original target of 200. The second way that we work is we help charities to acquire housing, or acquire housing that can be leased by charities. So that's basically the model that Simon just walked through. This is particularly significant in the current situation where we're really working at pace to prevent people housed during the pandemic from going back to the streets. Because of the urgency, we can't just really kind of build our way out of this short-term urgent situation. So Simon talked about the partnership with St. Mungo's delivering more than 800 homes in the past few years and raising more than £200 million. I'd also like to mention another innovative model developed by Social and Sustainable Capital, which is really kind of co-developed by listening to charities that they work with. It's a very simple loan to charities, 2 to 5 million, but it's really flexible compared to a normal kind of bank loan. It shares risks with the borrowers around voids, around bad debts, around arrears. It also provides the charity the option to hand back the keys, so basically return the properties to the fund at a pre-agreed price after 10 years. It's already supported charities to provide housing for people at risk of homelessness, but also some of the more specialist supportive service, such as survivors of domestic abuse and asylum seekers. And finally, we build new housing. We know that in the long term, the supply-demand mismatch is really what is the root cause of all of this. And we want to address this by building more decent, affordable housing. And in this space, really, we've seen massive change in the past 3 years. Big names like CBRE, like L&G, like BlackRock are moving to the space and providing funding to housing providers. It's also moving away from straightforward debt funding, borrowing, to more of an equity model where long-term leases are signed with housing associations. So I guess what I'm saying is there's now a broader range of options. And if there's kind of one thing that I really want you to take away is the power dynamics have really shifted now with more options, I think, for charities and social enterprises working in this space. Really, it would be great if you can just kind of explore the range of options in front of you and try to negotiate and try to find what is a suitable thing. A lot of times people find social investment quite difficult or quite complex, and you always feel like you're being kind of due diligence and checked on. But I think this has really kind of shifted in the past few years. So just gonna pause here.
Thank you. Please keep sending your question through the chat. I'll combine them and fire them to our speaker who don't know what is coming at them. So one of the things that is coming up is the choice of outcome metrics. Like Andrea, before you mentioned, or sometimes these outcome metrics, you need to be very careful how you choose them because you don't want them to constrain you in adapting your model. And so I was wondering if I might start with Andrea and maybe asking Gary if you could share, like across different projects you looked at, how do you go about defining this metric? Do we know some metrics that are better than other, or can you keep some flexibility? What is the advice if I need to design a new instrument? What should I measure? Maybe I'll start with Gary. What have you seen?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is that there are a set of metrics that, because of the necessities of the contracting mechanism in a pay for success contract, do tend to be more narrow. So these might trigger out payment based on success, or no payment based on not success. But more and more of the actual projects are including a set of other outcomes that they want to track. And that goes beyond, just the payment mechanism. Now, one might, be afraid that because some are triggering payment and some are not, that those that are triggering payment will have a more focused attention placed on them. And we're still waiting to kind of see how that's playing out. But if you think about a contracting mechanism in social investment, like a social impact bond, I think one of the things that we have to do is to judge it based on its ability to identify, scale, and diffuse programs that are more effective. And in some ways, I think Andrea said it in terms of her own personal experience in Los Angeles. And based on a few interviews that I've done, I haven't done extensive interviews, but the few interviews that I've done, I've heard that refrain over and over again, that what people really liked about the social impact bond process is that it brought in stakeholders who actually had the power to adjust their own system. So whether it's a department in LA, which was the Office of Diversion and Reentry, or it was some other department, that was providing healthcare to women who were pregnant, because they were so involved in the construction of the contract, they were keenly aware of what they ought to do based on any evidence. That evidence might be those metrics that are in the social impact bond contract, but that also might be based on the evidence that you're also asking the evaluator to track. So I would say at a minimum, you ought to ask, if you're going to use this mechanism for social investment, the pay for success contract, that you ought to track a broader set of metrics, because the people who actually are going to act on the success of that contract, which in these cases is typically the government, needs to have full information, and not just information that would be contained based on the triggering metrics for payment.
Thank you, Gary. Andrea, can you share more about your experience of, it seemed you had a particular example in mind of, we were measuring these, and with hindsight, maybe we would have used a different metric.
Yeah, well, we went back and forth about the metrics throughout the whole process, as I'm sure other communities often do, and landed on, number of returns to jail, as well as housing stability. And they seemed very straightforward, but as we dug into the complexities of what happens when people become involved in the criminal justice system and have complex mental and behavioral health needs, we found that they were a little bit simplistic. I think Gary's right. It's the whole picture. It's what else you look at. And I also think that we had a sense of who these clients were, but they were actually much more complex than we thought they were going to be. Their needs were much more intensive. And actually, for several of the clients, supportive housing wasn't enough. Some of them really needed something more like a skilled nursing facility. And so you also aren't 100% sure sometimes about the population, despite us running the pilot projects. When we really started to expand the project, the population shifted a little bit as well. And so you got to, my best recommendation is to be very careful about selecting your metrics. I think Gary's suggestion is great, broadening them. I think having a clear communications plan about how you talk about the work and the progress. So even if these are the payments, we should really look at the full picture when deciding as a community about what the project looks like in the long run. When the initiative is over, how do we continue to scale and adapt? I think not waiting for the results to come out to start having that dialogue and conversation is really important. One of the things that the Hilton Foundation has found to be immensely successful in many of the projects we work in, not just pay for success, but anytime we're trying to spur systemic change through social innovation, has been to include the public sector at the table from the very beginning. Allow them to be part of your grant making process by asking them what their challenges are, where they see speed bumps in the road or barriers to success, and work collaboratively with them, with the providers, serving as a connector for everyone, bringing everyone together and helping to resolve through dialogue and collaboration what some of those challenges are, and then using the philanthropic funding to support that, whatever that may look like. And then what we have found is that 2-3 years down the road, after we've run that work, the public sector has a personal investment, which makes them want to advocate for budget funding or shifts to continue those innovative changes in the long run.
Simon, you want to add?
If I could just add, because I think, when it's a question about impact measurement, our experience has been, again, we've always wanted to go back to the social enterprise itself and sit down with them, often in a workshop, often bringing in people from the front line and the teams that are working with people with lived experience, and basically say, what is your theory of change, or what is it that's making this model work? And just be really sure that the metrics grow from that rather than from anywhere else. In the case of the homelessness property funds 10 years ago, it was sitting down with the Mungo's team and saying, for this model, which is about low support need and it's about overcoming barriers to this particular move, what is it that makes it work? You've been doing it for a number of years now. And, they told us 3 things. They said, look, it's about whether the tenant gets more options in the private rented sector beyond this initial tenancy. It's about progression towards work and employment, but at least training and education prior to that. And it's about resilience against homelessness and a number of factors that can be built during a tenancy of this nature that prevent fall back into a homeless environment. So we just built 2 or 3 simple measures off each of those pillars. And it's been a great steering guide through the years. Those measures have changed over time and new ones have been added, particularly as the cohort changed and had to adapt to different needs. But we really saw the benefit of starting from that perspective, which I think for most people sounds obvious, but we do engage with investors for whom there is a different perspective often around impact measurement, which is impact measurement is to allow us to determine how much impact we've generated and to compare it. And sometimes these things can be at odds with each other. So comparability is great on impact measurement. We love it when we can achieve it, and there are other ways of doing that, but the right place to start is with the social enterprise, we think.
Thank you, Simon. That resonates with what Gary was saying about the step of the co-creation and the co-production in this type of instrument. I have a question for either Karen or Simon in terms of as a social investor. Can you share what are the particular challenges in making social investments? So Andrea before was saying, oh, I wonder, this seems so complicated, maybe a grant could have done just as well. And so from the perspective of social investors, how do you select? There are some challenges because it takes time, you define this metric. What are the key challenges, and over your experience, what have you learned? Like, how can you mitigate these challenges, and how can you benefit from the key advantages?
Yeah, maybe I can start first. Definitely, I think luckily, I think in the past few years where I've worked at Big Society Capital, I do see a shift in terms of people getting a bit clearer on what's a grant, what's a social investment, how are they different. So essentially, I guess social investment is something that you would need to repay. And I guess what is so crucial, I guess, for people to understand is that an investment needs to be underpinned by a revenue model, whether that revenue comes from your rental income or your trading or some services that you provide or goods that you produce. It has to be backed by that, and there needs to be, I guess, backed by some level of track record or evidence that you have the ability to take on that repayable finance, which is quite different from a grant that purely looks at the kind of social impact outcomes that people deliver. So I think the crucial challenge is, I guess, for social enterprises and charities to understand in some cases that taking on social investment might be a great idea, but in some others it might not. I'll just give you an example that is quite topical, I guess. because of COVID-19, I guess in the past few months, we've also shifted quite a lot of our energy into creating emergency facilities for organizations that might want to take on social investment. So it's really, I think, working with the social enterprises and charities to help them understand whether this funding that they're applying for is to plug a gap in their revenue, and they actually have the confidence and the evidence to repay that going forward, or is it to kind of basically plug something that will never get repaid. So for example, it's a huge disruption in their business model that is a one-off support that then will signpost them to grant funders. So I think kind of getting that distinction right, and it's becoming more challenging with all these challenges, kind of outside market challenges coming up as well. Simon, I don't know whether, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think two big challenges that spring to mind are, firstly, really identifying which bits of the model are genuinely an enterprise which can be self-sustaining, and which bits are going to need a form of philanthropic capital. So that kind of blended capital approach, but how you do the blend and where you place each part of that capital is often for us, part of the challenge in designing something. And then I think the second thing is, where are the risks placed and who takes which risks? And, that does have to change according to the model. I think in the example I've been talking about, in the mainstream kind of large scale move on accommodation for people with low needs, it's been very appropriate for the larger scale organizations we now partner with to take the tenant risk, because actually that was the key barrier that was preventing investors from backing this model, because they can't assess a tenant of that nature, but inherently the organizations we partner with can. So they should take that risk, and they have taken that risk, and it's been one of the reasons this has scaled successfully and allowed them to have the capital they need. But in the example I gave of working with women's sector organizations, often smaller scale organizations who don't have as much housing capacity or experience, it wouldn't be appropriate to place all of those risks on those organizations. And indeed, in some cases, they need partners who can share those risks with them as they try out new things, as they grow their own capacity and experience. So in that initiative, the lease structure shares that risk between the organization and the investor, a little bit like Karen alluded to in the loan structure that SASC have been using. We are looking at those kind of risk sharing models within leases, but appropriate to circumstance. That would not be appropriate in the former example, because it would never really have scaled quite as fast as it has, and the risk would not be placed with the right party. So I think you have to find that appropriate balance for each need.
Thank you, Simon. Can I just say, maybe it's just a follow-up question, both for Simon and Karen. You both talked about the importance of the revenue model and the transfer of risk. The obvious question is, in homelessness, talking about a revenue model and homelessness, doesn't it bring up some ethical challenges? It's like often you read about people like, oh, you are making a return on the fact that you are helping people who are homeless. Shouldn't that be a human right? Is this a challenge? Is it misplaced? Is that the wrong way to look at it? Is that the right way to look at it?
Yeah, I think in this country, in the UK, I can't speak for other countries. I think we're quite lucky in a sense that actually a lot of the revenue models underpinning, whether it's the homelessness services that are required or the housing that is required, are mostly, I think, underpinned by government funding. So actually a lot of the rental income that we talked about and the services that we talked about are ultimately backed by government. So I think in that sense, I think there's kind of less of an issue when it comes to kind of the ethical considerations. In other countries, I believe a lot of the kind of innovation will need to come from public and private sector kind of collaboration and schemes where I think Gary alluded to earlier that basically everyone, the social sector, the government, the public sector, all needs to come together to fund a whole project. And I guess the challenge there again is about who takes those risks, who funds which parts are sustainable and which parts are not.
Simon, I see you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality really is that an investor into an impact fund of the nature I've described is essentially putting their capital to work to provide a decent home for someone whose alternative is either to stay in a hostel or a bed and breakfast, which is not a place they want to be or their child wants to be, or for them to try to access the private rented sector with huge barriers in front of them. And if they do find a landlord, often a landlord who will not give them the security of the tenure that they want, will house them in poor, inappropriate accommodation, overcrowded, poor health conditions. So really, I think when you look at it in terms of what that creates versus the alternatives that people face, I think it's fairly clear cut. Now, are there different ways for society to solve some of these problems? Absolutely. I don't think anyone would hold out impact investment as the only basis one can do that. But I think when you take a starting point of an economy and a political system and a certain amount of social security net that has been created, I think one always finds the gaps that creates, and we see social enterprises primarily as being able to respond to that and create pathways that are more joined up, more focused on the individual and their journey, and often more successful in delivering the outcomes that people actually want. So we want to back that through investment, but again, it's not the only way to back those organizations. So hopefully that puts it in its context rather than making it a kind of yes or no kind of question.
Thank you, Simon. Gary, do we have evidence in the case of homelessness in particular that these new instruments are making a positive difference? What do we know? What is it that you are looking at?
Well, I think that it's still a little bit early to have, kind of some large scale evidence, because so few of for instance, the social impact bonds themselves, if we're focusing on that particular tool in the social investment continuum, actually have gotten to their end point. So typically we want to be able to say, okay, here we are, we've completed it, this is the evidence. But I think more broadly, and certainly Andrea can speak to what's happened here in Los Angeles, we can actually point to particular kinds of successes with respect to social investment broadly. And just the impact investing sector as it's maturing, and as you've heard from these distinguished practitioners of social investment, they're very clear about what it is you're trying to accomplish, how you're assessing risk, not just financial risk, but also political risk in terms of thinking about how to make such investments. There are some places where we actually have models that we know we can plug into, and Andrea shared that with respect to kind of a role of the philanthropic sector in a program-related investment to fund CDFIs, community development financial institutions, that can actually play this bridge capital role. And there are these kind of blended capital models now that are emerging that have actually shown to speed up the process of either building housing or providing services linked to housing. However, if the goal is actually to end homelessness, either of those who have chronic conditions or in homelessness more broadly, I think we do have to be a little more sanguine about saying anything in terms of we've achieved success. The reality, though, is that we didn't come to, in many countries around the world, in the developed world anyway, the kind of amount of homelessness overnight, but it was actually a long series of policy decisions that led us to having systems where housing was so expensive relative to people's incomes and those kinds of things. And so it shouldn't cause the social investment sector, kind of pause to say, well, we haven't actually seen homelessness end, so we aren't getting a return on our investment. The nice thing about investors is that they're pretty good about thinking about what's the alternative. So if we didn't spend the capital this way, where would we have gotten to? And you can actually envision where those places where things would have gotten worse. But at the same time, if you're a social investor, you need to have a much longer time horizon in terms of how you're thinking about recouping social returns. And to that end, I think we're right in the middle of that kind of process. Yes, act on early knowledge that's being created about, kind of smaller successes that lead to larger successes. But at the same time, we actually need to have a longer term horizon to get to the systems change that is absolutely needed in many places, certainly in the United States, to actually, fundamentally reduce the number of people experiencing homelessness.
Thank you, Gary. Andrea, can I pick up a point that you raised before on it takes so long, like trying these new ways of working, because all is so new, it takes a lot of energy. And at the foundation, you said you had some reflection about, well, maybe if we did it as you are used to do things, we would have had the same result. Can you share a little bit your insight of what was different and what you think might be better and worse? Probably there are both sides of a coin.
Yeah, I mean, I am a firm believer that, I mean, you have to try these things to know whether they work for your organization or for your community. I think there are complexities to Los Angeles County that made it more difficult because of the way we worked with the county. We have 5 county supervisors, plus we have the heads of several departments who had to be involved in this process. And I can see in a smaller community or a different region where you only have to get the mayor on board, or a small city council, it'd be different. In the city of Los Angeles, we have a mayor and 15 city council members who would have to get on board to do this sort of project. And that's a huge political lift. And so I think there are other dynamics that come into play based on the community that you're in. That said, we are at the foundation very, very excited about all sorts of kinds of social investment. When it comes to, historically, we've invested we've done low interest loans to community development financial institutions, but we are beginning to look at developers who are trying to build affordable housing without using any public subsidies, speeding up the process. We've invested in a loan fund that has developers building on smaller pieces of property, right? So as Karen mentioned, we can't build our way out of it, but we do have to continue to invest in construction over the long term, because that's really how we got into this situation in the first place. And so any ways we can use investment as an innovative tool, I know that more ideas and innovations and different iterations of this will come out over time. And who knows, 4 or 5 years from now, we may have cracked the nut on really what a smart performance-based contract might look like for a large community like LA County, and we may try it again. But I think the circumstances would probably be a little bit different. But it was a great learning exercise. It was a great collaborative building exercise. Here in Los Angeles, it really helped to launch our Office of Diversion and Reentry, which is very unique in this country, even to have a division that focuses on this specifically. And it has become a huge catalyst for change. It's led by incredible leaders. And it looks like that division will continue to grow as we reduce criminalization and decrease our investment in the criminal justice system here in LA County. So if you say the result is this robust public entity that can take on this current movement around the decreasing of criminalization and decreasing resources in criminal justice, I'd say it was a huge success. So it's a matter of perspective.
Thank you so much, Andrea. We only have 5 minutes to the end of the hour. And I'm thinking the title of this session is Social Investment and Homelessness, Perils and Opportunity. Can I give you your typical 30 seconds, 45 seconds statement of one peril and one opportunity that you see in the use of social investment and homelessness? Your top one. I'll start with Gary, given he's a professor and they always have something to say very quickly.
Yes, thank you. No, it's been a pleasure to really have this conversation and to think about these issues even more deeply. I think that the peril that I see with social investment is that capital, in the structures around capital can often move back to private sector ways of thinking in terms of return and so on and so forth. That's something that no matter what we're talking about with social investment, I think we have to keep front and center. I think the opportunity is to, there's a lot of socially minded investors out there that kind of don't want to fit in the space of pure grant giving, but they actually want to kind of think about that space that our colleagues on the panel are operating in, where there is some sort of recoverable loan, there's some sort of investment, it may be lower rates of return and so on and so forth, but they actually, that's where the space they want to participate in, maybe because of their background or not. And I do think there is a tremendous opportunity for two things. One is to imagine new tools and structures that can facilitate that. The social impact bond is still a really nascent tool in many ways, and it's still unclear whether it is such a tool to facilitate and accelerate private capital being involved or social investment capital being involved. So I do think that there's opportunity for investment in the tool, but I also think that there's opportunity to invest toward different metrics around equity. And to me, the more we can actually envision what those metrics are around equity, the more success that social investment capital might have in terms of catalyzing investment from people who want to.
Thank you. I think I'm over optimistic when I ask an academic to be succinct. So who wants to add a point? We will not have time to go around all of you. So thank you so much, Gary. It was very eloquent. Key opportunity or a key word of warning, Simon?
I think if you were to ask me to sum up the peril, it's that money calls the shots. When the investment is around, it can be a heavily incentivizing thing for people to change the way they do what they do. And we talked about metrics that people can set, but also the terms of the investment and the like. So I think it's about listening to the users of capital. The opportunity is that this is a massive source of resource that these problems can tap into, and I think it can change the power balance in some subtle ways if done right, and it can allow organizations to take more control and be more empowered rather than less. So that's a huge opportunity.
Thank you, Simon. Andrea or Karen? And Karen?
I'll just quickly say that I guess the peril would be that the overpromise, like people getting overexcited about something that there's still so much to learn about. And the opportunity is this opportunity for investment from partners who otherwise may never consider it, because those extra $3, $4, $5, $7, $10 million can make a massive difference. So if you can create spaces for capital that otherwise wouldn't be interested in this as an opportunity, that's pretty massive.
Thank you. Karen?
Very quickly, I think one do's and one don'ts. I guess, as I said before, do shop around. There's more options now if you're a charity looking for social investment options. And I guess the don't is don't just think about the kind of the scheme, the kind of short-term plan that you have, but more thinking about your longer-term sustainability. I'll quote my favorite story here. 20 years ago, there's an organization called Preston Road Women's Center, which is also one of Simon's partners in the Women in Safe Homes Fund. 20 years ago, 97% of their income comes from charitable donations and government grants. Today, only 17%. And that's because they've used social investment to build a portfolio of housing to serve their clients, but also to really improve their financial sustainability from kind of 5 houses kind of now building to 120 houses in their portfolio. And they're kind of a full-fledged property management team over there. So just, I guess, to end on an inspirational note.
Thank you so much, Karen. Very much inspiring indeed. I just want to call the session to a close. I want to thank all the speakers and again, the Center for Homelessness Impact for giving us the opportunity to share these insights. And to all the audience for following us. We hope the session was informative and helpful. Thank you, everyone.